Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 48 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the New York Rangers, in which the Sharks have won 3-2 in overtime. The Sharks now find themselves on a 3-game winning streak, something that you would have not thought to be said about this team just a couple of weeks ago, and all 3 of these wins have come since the return of Captain Logan Couture to the lineup, which is likely not all that much of a coincidence. And so this is a pretty exciting time for the San Jose Sharks roster, at the very least in the short term, because if we actually look more so into the long term, this is actually a bit of a dangerous spot that the Sharks find themselves in. The goal of actually making the playoffs, that ship sailed all the way back in October, which means the ultimate goal for this team is actually getting the best possible odds in the draft lottery by the end of this season. And to do that, it requires to finish last place in the league. And while the Sharks do still find themselves with a position there in 32nd place, it is a lot more precarious than it was just about a week ago, as they're now tied with the Chicago Blackhawks for that 32nd place spot, even though Chicago has a game in hand, and they're only a handful of points behind the Anaheim Ducks. So in a week's time, if the Sharks' success does continue, and it's likely that the Ducks and the Blackhawks don't really find much success for themselves, we may be talking about the Sharks now with the 3rd best draft lottery odds. And it is quite reminiscent to what happened last season, though we are still pretty early on at this point, when the Sharks had a 3-game winning streak in March, which ended up playing themselves out of last place then, and giving themselves just the 4th best odds in the draft lottery. So it is a sort of history repeating itself type of situation for this team. But of course, for the players in the locker room, for the coaching staff there, this is still a fantastic moment for them. It was, like I said, just a couple of weeks ago where they were on a massive loss streak where it just felt as though nothing could go right for the team, and now suddenly the bounces are going the way, the calls are going this way, and as such it has led to these 3 victories in a row. But let us indeed dive into how this game went down. It was a bit of a tough situation for the Sharks just coming into this one, with some travel, even if it's not particularly far, and a back-to-back situation against 2 pretty tough teams. No one would have really blamed the San Jose Sharks for losing this game against a strong Rangers squad. And early on, it looked as though it was going to be heading that way. The Rangers were the better team for the first few minutes and would pot the first goal of this game coming from Adam Fox on some pretty bad defensive coverage in front by the San Jose Sharks. And yet by the end of this first period, the Sharks began to fight back a bit. While they weren't getting tons of chances, they were getting some okay zone time, some decent shots on net, and ended up equalizing at least somewhat in that area. And as such, it was only a 1-0 Rangers lead by the end of the first period. In the second, things did open up slightly more, New York continuing to press, and would end up getting the next goal of the game from Artemi Panarin, but the Sharks would do a reasonable enough job at limiting what the Rangers could do in this second period to stem the bleeding and leave it to just a 2-goal lead, compared to Kaapo Kähkönen the other night against the Los Angeles Kings, where he had to make tons of amazing saves. Blackwood, while he was called upon a decent amount, was not necessarily having to stand on his head here tonight to keep the Sharks alive. And yet heading into the third period, while the Sharks were doing an okay job at limiting what the Rangers could do, they weren't generating too many chances for themselves. There were a couple. Obviously the big one that stands out is that Kyle Burroughs flub, where he had the ultimate empty net goal for himself and he just somehow deflected that puck wide. But otherwise, not a ton of chances for this team. And yet we can recall back to the first matchup between these two teams, what was it, like a couple of months ago at this point, when the Sharks were trailing by, I believe, 3 goals in the early parts of the third period, 6-3, and they scored 2 quick ones to almost complete that comeback. This time they were only down 2 goals, and they again score 2 quick ones, this time early on in the third period. And coming from their bottom 6, Nico Sturm gets a fortunate giveaway from the Rangers players and is able to push that one past Shesterkin to cut the lead in half. And then a few minutes later, it is Ryan Carpenter on a tip-in that ties up the game. And usually this season, when the San Jose Sharks have managed to make some sort of comeback against a good team, that good team ends up waking up a bit and then just sort of pushes and pressures the San Jose Sharks until they break. That didn't really happen. I was expecting the last 10-15 minutes of this game to really be Rangers controlled, and yet the Sharks didn't give up a ton to them. Obviously, some chances, as is always going to be the case, but for a team that is in last place compared to a team that leads their division in the Eastern Conference, it didn't really look like that in this third period. And so the Sharks headed into overtime with the game tied at 2. And here is really where the Sharks got their biggest break of the game. If this was a situation happening to the Sharks, if the shoe was on the other foot here, I would have definitely been extremely upset, as what happens is that Barabanov has the puck, Jan Rutta comes in and sets up a pick play, which knocks down the Rangers defender and causes him to even drop his stick in that situation, which sets the Sharks up for a 3-on-2 down low. Barabanov makes a nice move to avoid his man, passes it over to Rutta, who then passes it over to Hertl for the empty net tap-in and the overtime game winner. This is the type of pick play that does happen multiple times per game, and usually the only ones that actually get called for interference are the egregious ones, but this Rutta play was definitely pretty egregious. I don't know how the referees ended up missing it. Maybe they thought that the Rangers player kind of dove a bit. I'm not entirely sure, but again, if this had happened to the Sharks, I would have been very, very upset. But this is the type of situations that were going against the San Jose Sharks back when they were on that massive, massive losing streak. So sometimes what goes around comes around, even if that doesn't really feel all that great from a Rangers perspective. But moving on to the players to talk about, we have the top line of Zetterlund, Hertl, and Hoffman. In fact, all of the forward lines were actually kept the same as what they were heading in to the Los Angeles Kings game. While there were some modifications during that game, they did not stick here tonight, at least heading into it. So Hoffman did indeed still find himself on the top line. And while I did like Hoffman's performance the previous night against the Los Angeles Kings, it didn't really carry in here tonight against the Rangers. I thought Hoffman was a lot less effective. Much of his capabilities came in the previous game off of some small, sneaky, just strong positioning type of plays. Didn't really feel that same way about him here tonight. Seemed a step below and a step behind at times, which caused him to not be particularly good. I was honestly somewhat surprised that he wasn't once again dropped off that top line. When it comes to his other two line mates, however, I do think there were some good things from both of these players. Zetterlund continued to get some shots, to get some pressure, wants to move that puck forward, which is always a very good thing, and it's just generally a high effort player for the San Jose Sharks. And Hertl, there were some give and take, as has really been the case for much of this season for Tomas Hertl. There are some shifts where he kind of looks a bit disengaged, and then there are other shifts where he's just pushing and bullying his way through multiple Rangers and other teams' defensive players. And I thought there were more positives than negative for Hertl here tonight, so a pretty decent game. And of course, the overtime winner goes to him as well. When it comes to this second line, it was a bit of an odd game for these three players. Now, they were the worst line for the San Jose Sharks in the previous one against the Los Angeles Kings, and you could technically make the argument that that is again the case here tonight against the Rangers. There were some positives from these three players. In the early parts of this game, these players were actually getting some really good chances on net. In fact, in the first period, this was the line that looked the best for San Jose from a high danger opportunity standpoint. The problem is that these three players together, there's not really much work getting done in the offensive zone. They're not really doing the kind of the hard work, so to speak. Not to say that they're not working hard, but bear with me here. They're not exactly doing the hard work, so to speak, to establish the forecheck, get some good offensive zone time. They're more so benefiting from their individual high skill level, in particular when it comes to the two wingers on this line, both Duclair and Barabanov, to try and make some things happen. We saw a couple of shifts where Barabanov had some slick stick puck maneuvering. One of them, of course, was at the overtime play, a nice play there that leads to the Tomas Hertl power play goal. But from a general consistent line standpoint for these three players, it actually wasn't all that great here tonight, and they found themselves more often than not playing in the defensive zone and just not being particularly effective for David Quinn and the San Jose Sharks. So again, I do give the slight benefit of the doubt to Logan Couture, who continues to try and get up to game speed, but when it comes to his two line mates, Duclair and Barabanov, who have been struggling for much of this season, it feels as though the struggles just kind of continue from here on. Moving on to the third line, we have Kunin with Sturm and Eklund once more. So Eklund, he continues his bit of a wild ride. He was placed on the third line at the beginning of last game against the Los Angeles Kings, not as a demotion, according to David Quinn, but instead to try and get him against easier competition. But then he got promoted back up to the top 6 halfway through that Los Angeles Kings game. Somehow, I guess the playing against the lower competition does not stick forever, but then it comes right back to the third line to again continue to experiment in that role. So like I said, bit of a wild ride here, but it seems to be working out for Eklund, who once again had a pretty solid game. I will not say that he had the high highs that he had in the previous game against the Los Angeles Kings, but I thought he was one of their most effective forwards still here tonight, making some really solid things happen for the third line, which was generally playing in the offensive zone much more than they were actually playing in the defensive zone, which kind of, now that you find yourself in the bottom 6, is your ultimate goal as a bottom 6 player. When it comes to Kunin, I wasn't a huge fan of Kunin's performance here tonight. It was generally okay, I guess, which is definitely much more than you could say about him like 3 weeks ago when he was exceptionally bad. But he was definitely the weakest link on this third line because Nico Sturm, I thought, had a pretty solid game. Definitely a huge redemption from yesterday where he was good at the end of it but had a really, really tough start. So nice to see that the third line paid off quite well for the Sharks and, of course, got a goal here tonight for them. And then we have the fourth line, which just continues to roll for San Jose. Yet another fourth line goal here tonight. Yesterday it was Justin Bailey. Tonight it is Ryan Carpenter. And I do want to talk a bit about Justin Bailey because I thought he was one of the more effective fourth liners for the San Jose Sharks out of these 3 players. Yesterday I had singled out Zdina. Tonight I'm going to be singling out Bailey. While I don't think he was necessarily consistent throughout the entire game, as it felt as though his last couple of shifts weren't super effective, I did notice him a lot through the first couple of periods in this one, giving some solid fourth line shifts for the San Jose Sharks. Ryan Carpenter, who honestly, like 2-3 weeks ago, kind of like with Luke Kunin, was really, really bad. But over these past couple of games, he's been doing a solid job at rebounding and centering a good fourth line for the Sharks. Moving on to the defense. This was the big question mark for San Jose here tonight. Who would really step up in the absence of Mario Ferraro? And it felt as though that Henry Thrun was that guy leading the Sharks defensively in ice time, at least until he had to step away for a few minutes due to injury late in the third period. Would eventually return for the first shift in overtime, so he didn't, I believe, drop that title of most ice time. And I thought Thrun did a very admirable job against an extremely offensively talented New York Rangers team. Were things perfect here tonight? Absolutely not. Was he stellar and making all the correct choices? Also not. But was he solid enough as a number 1 defenseman again against such a strong opponent? Absolutely yes, which bodes exceptionally well for the San Jose Sharks moving forward. It has been nice to see Thrun's very quick development over these last few months, where when he was first called up, he was a disaster in his own zone, and suddenly now he is so trustworthy that he ends up being the number 1 guy when Ferraro has to step out of the lineup due to injury. It is quite nice to see. But interestingly enough, the show was actually somewhat stolen by his defensive partner here tonight, Jan Rutta. Usually it is Thrun who is outperforming Rutta in these situations, and he's kind of just in the shadow of Thrun. But here tonight, the script was flipped, and Rutta had a very, very solid game. Pretty good defensively, but also making some things happen offensively. He was the guy who made the pick happen, and while you could obviously argue that that should have absolutely been a penalty, it is still the game-winning play, technically. And he also had the shot that would lead to that would be deflected by Ryan Carpenter that would tie this game. So generally a very solid game for Jan Rutta. When it comes to the second pairing, if you could really call them that, I promoted both Okhotyuk and Burrows, in my eyes at the very least, to that second pairing. And this was actually a very effective game, in particular for Kyle Burrows. I mentioned early on he had a very, very good chance in the first period for the tap-in off of a nice pass from Tomas Hertl that he just barely missed out on. But even looking past that, defensively, he was quite solid. And Burrows was honestly somewhat dragged down in the previous game against the Kings by his defensive partner, Nikita Okhotyuk. Okhotyuk played better here tonight, which allowed Burrows to play much better here tonight, and I thought he had a very solid game. He was also someone to look at for the San Jose Sharks as trying to step into a slightly bigger role in the absence of Mario Ferraro, and I thought he did a pretty good job at that. When it comes to this third defensive pairing of Vlasic and Addison, I will say I do think Vlasic continues to be pretty decent for San Jose. Maybe not as great as he has been over the past few games, but still actually rather solid and much better than he was a few weeks ago, in the same vein as many of the other San Jose Sharks forwards. Calen Addison, on the other hand, again, I'm still just not remotely impressed with what he's bringing to the table for the San Jose Sharks. It was not a liability type of terrible game for Calen Addison, which is something that we've honestly seen a ton of times, so maybe that's like a slight positive for him, but it also wasn't just a good game at all either for number 33. So he draws into the lineup because of the injury to Mario Ferraro and also because of multiple other injuries to players like Jacob McDonald and Ty Emberson. So the Sharks don't really have that much of a better option, at least at the NHL level. Technically they could dig into the AHL if they wanted to, but at this point they don't seem to want to go that route. So Calen Addison does have a top 6 spot, at least for the foreseeable future, but it's not a very good one at that. And then finally, we have the goaltender Mackenzie Blackwood. Like I said, not necessarily called upon as much as his partner in crime, Kaapo Kähkönen, was in the previous game against the Los Angeles Kings, but he still put up a very solid performance, made some solid saves here tonight against a strong New York Rangers team, only gave up 2 goals, and gave the Sharks a chance to win, which they capitalized on with this 3-2 victory. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday when they will take on the Buffalo Sabres, a team that just a couple of weeks ago shut them out. So the Sharks will of course be looking for some revenge and to extend this winning streak. Class dismissed.